So this is part 3 of chapter 54's lecture, and we left off talking about biodiversity or species diversity in a community. So first of all, just to recap that, species diversity is the variety of different kinds of organisms that make up the community. And that's broken into two components, the species richness, which is the total number of different species in the community, and then there's relative abundance, which is the proportion of each species representing all the individuals in the community. So, and I was talking a little bit about the Shannon Index or Shannon Diversity Index. And I again want to emphasize that you don't need to be able to calculate this. I just want you to be aware of what it is. And it is a way to mathematically evaluate a community in terms of its richness versus the relative abundance of each species. So focusing again on why species diversity is important is that basically it comes down to greater diversity makes that community more stable. It produces or it offers a number of things that are listed here on this slide. Greater biodiversity is going to offer more production because there's more biomass being produced, which is the total mass of all the organisms added up together. The productivity will be more stable if there's more diversity. And also, the community will be better able to withstand and recover from any sort of environmental stress. So that means that it will be more resilient. And that resilience, it includes being more resistant to invasive species. If you have a lot of variety of your species already, then an invasive species will not be able to get quite the same stranglehold. Perhaps there will be something that outcompetes it instead of the other way around. So let's see, moving on here. The other part of evaluating the structure of a community is looking at the feeding relationships. So we call that the trophic structure between organisms in the community. And if you remember back to your general biology, the trophic levels of a energy pyramid is what we're referring to here, where we start with the bottom with the greatest biomass usually being the producers, and then the primary consumers and secondary consumers, and then the top tertiary consumer usually. This makes up a rough food chain which links these trophic levels from the producers down at the bottom to the top carnivores at the top. And each level of that pyramid gets smaller because of the loss of energy that's occurring and the inefficient passing on of energy between the different trophic levels. So if you hopefully recall back from general biology that concept. If not, do a quick review on, again, online. Check out a video or two or just do some reading on the loss of energy between trophic levels because you may need to calculate that in a problem. The next slide will show you what that food chain can look like. There's one that's terrestrial here on the left and one that's marine on the right. Again, talking about primary producers being our plants, the ones that take the sun's energy and convert it into consumable energy for the next levels of the food chain, next trophic levels. Our primary consumers are herbivores. Then we have secondary consumers, which eat the primary herbivores, and then the tertiary and quaternary. And again, generally, these chains don't usually go beyond these 4 levels above producer. The energetic hypothesis suggests that the food chain length is limited by that inefficient energy transfer. Again, these are very general principles, but it's estimated that only about 10% of the energy stored in organic matter at each trophic level is converted to organic matter at the next trophic level. So what does that mean exactly? How is energy stored in organic matter? Well, it basically is going to come down to cellular respiration and the production of sugars and the burning of sugars. And so that foundation of carbon being stored in the body of the individuals in the population or the species is going to be what is available to the predator who eats that. For example, a producer level can have 100 kilograms of biomass of its plant material, but that can only support about 10 kilograms of herbivore biomass because of that inefficient 10% energy transfer. And then of the herbivores, only 1 kilogram is going to be able to support, or that 10 kilograms of herbivore will only support 1 kilogram of the next carnivore biomass. So that primary or secondary consumer, actually, primary carnivore. So now the other portion of community structure is the relative dominance of different species within the community. So there are two types of dominant species. Well, let me use that term very clearly. When we talk about a dominant species, what we're talking about is the one that is most abundant or the one that has the highest biomass in the community, which may be different from the keystone species. But both of these species are very influential. They exert a regulating effect on the other species in the community. So, for example, if the dominant species is a producer of some sort that's supporting all the herbivores, well, if that producer, that species, becomes threatened in some way, then that's going to affect every other member of that food chain. Because starting from the very beginning, if we lower the available biomass and available energy of the producers to the first consumer, which would be the herbivores, then the herbivore population is going to decrease. It's going to die off because it doesn't have enough food, and then so on up the line. And the contrast then with that is the keystone species, which is, I'll go into that in a little bit more here in just a second. So the keystone species is different in that it is not necessarily the most abundant, but it plays such an influential role in the entire food web or food chain of the community, those feeding relationships, that without it, the communities would collapse. It just wouldn't survive. So in this case, we have a sea otter is a keystone predator in the North Pacific, and it eats sea urchins. So when it's healthy, when they're the correct number of sea otters, then we have killer whales controlling the size of the sea otter population, which is eating the sea urchins, which are actually consuming the algae here. So this is a balanced side when the killer whales are controlling it. But you can see if we have too many sea otters, if, for example, there aren't killer whales around to control the size of this population, they tend to eat a lot of the sea urchins, which then makes there not be enough sea urchins to control the amount of algae that is growing, or the kelp. So the plants are going to be overpopulating. So there are different types of control that a keystone species can exert. It can either be bottom up, which would be the availability of nutrients, or the top down, the availability or the number of predators that there are. So the bottom up model of community organization is saying that there is a unidirectional influence from lower to higher trophic levels, which makes sense. So in this case, the presence or absence of the mineral nutrients of the producers, for example, well, actually, the presence or absence of mineral nutrients as an abiotic factor can control the plant numbers, which then will control the herbivore numbers, which will then control the predator numbers. So there's a bottom-up control going on just based on actually an abiotic factor, which would be mineral nutrients. On the other hand, we have a top-down model, which is called the trophic cascade model, which is proposing that the control comes from the trophic levels above. So in this case, like with the sea otter, we have predators that are limiting the herbivores, which are limiting the plants, and then the plants are limiting the nutrient levels. So we have the influence going the opposite direction. Okay, very straightforward. Okay, another term I want to make sure you understand is biomanipulation. So in this case, we have the introduction of something to help restore the balance in a community. So either the dominant species or the keystone species has, for example, gotten out of balance, and the whole community becomes damaged and unhealthy. The biodiversity is threatened, the stability of the relationships between the different populations becomes threatened as well. So what happens is they can introduce something, for example, in the Finnish lakes, they added a type of fish called a pike perch, which is a tertiary consumer to control a roach population, which then allowed the zooplankton population to increase. And this was in response to eutrophication, which is when there are minerals added to bodies of water, usually lakes, but sometimes even the inlets of a bay can experience eutrophication. So what will happen is, for example, farmlands will have runoff of nitrogen from the fertilizers, and that nitrogen is also a fertilizer to the cyanobacteria, which are primary producers. And so they go crazy because all of a sudden they have a huge nutrient surplus. And so this is a bottom-up situation where the cyanobacteria then start just going crazy and overtaking all the other populations. It also is compounded when the zooplankton, in the case of these Finnish lakes, were eaten by large populations of roachfish, which are secondary consumers. So roachfish, again, now this would be an example of a top-down situation where we have roachfish over-consuming the zooplankton, which can no longer control the cyanobacteria. And so we get everything out of balance. So by adding pike perch, which eat those roach fish, then we can allow the zooplankton populations to increase back to a stable level, and then they can control and manage the cyanobacteria blooms or overpopulation. So this is biomanipulation. Okay, so our last concept is to discuss succession. So succession is essentially, again, thinking of the structure of a community and what happens over time. So it's the sequence of community changes, particularly after some sort of disturbance. And there's just some definitions that you need to be familiar with. So this can be something that happens quickly, or it can happen over a long period of time, and it usually will be something that's a little more slow. But we have both primary and secondary succession. So primary succession is only going to occur when the soil has been removed by some sort of disturbance.